Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Tim O'Toole. What is up, Tim?
Very good to be here, Brian.
Yes, as it seems between every recording we do, it is a long, hard-fought road between each episode as we deal with these slings and arrows that the pandemic has to throw our way and everything else that's going on in the world right now. So
time passes quick, though. I mean, it seems like we just recorded the last one, but here we are.
Here we are. A lot has changed since the last one. Today we're recording this on Wednesday, July 22nd. We're a little off our normal recording schedule. This will go up next week on our most likely on our normal Tuesday schedule, but we did want to get this one in because of some travel and vacation plans and other things coming up for various folks. So thank you for joining us. Happy to be back with you again after the last episode when China officially took over the podcast. I think, not surprisingly, China is their presence will be felt and seen and heard very prominently on this episode as well. So before we get to the substance, just with the normal, I'll dispense with the normal introductory notes. We're not discussing any confidential information today. We're not providing legal advice. We're just having, as we said, an open discussion about a variety of topics, trade-related topics. Also, for those of you out there, again, and again, we thank everybody who continues to listen and support the pod. Please give us a rating, subscribe. We are on Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Overcast, YouTube, wherever you get your content, your pod content. Please subscribe, give us a rating, and hopefully join us every 2 weeks when we put up new episodes. So before we jump in, just to give a little roadmap, as usual, we are going to start with China, sort of what we're calling the China Roundup. This may become a semi-permanent segment at the outset of each episode. We're going to cover the latest on Hong Kong. We're going to cover some other interesting actions related to that, and related to other sanctions that have been imposed by both the U.S. and by China to counter U.S. actions of late. That'll be sort of the first chunk of the podcast. And then we have two OFAC enforcement actions that have come out in recent weeks that we're going to cover. One is the settlement with Amazon, and one is the North Korean matter Accentra FZE, which is a joint DOJ OFAC resolution that just came out about a week ago. And then in the lightning round, we're going to be especially lightning. We're just going to cover one issue, one kind of traditional lightning round topic, some designations touching on Nicaragua. And then we're going to end on a slightly more personal lightning round note, and we're going to talk a bit about human rights as an underpinning for many of the sanctions actions that the U.S. takes, and some recent experiences Tim and I have had that sort of touch upon that, and just some thoughts that we want to share on that generally. So before we dive in, Tim, anything more before we get going with before we go back to China once again?
Just to be clear, in case CFIUS is listening, China has not really taken over the pod. They have no control over the pod. They have not invested in the pod. So please don't try to unwind the pod, CFIUS, just because we're
there's no equity. They have no equity stake. They don't have access to material, non-public technical information.
Exactly.
So please.
Just wanted that to be clear for the record.
That's important. And for those of you who get that CFIUS joke, then my hat is off to you. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into, as I said, the China Roundup. There's going to be topic number one. There's kind of three parts to this. I think the big news from the last couple of weeks was, as we previewed on the last pod, the passage of the Hong Kong Autonomy Act by Congress, and it was sitting on the president's desk, and he did indeed sign it, as we noted he would really have to, whether he wanted to or not. And that happened last week on July 14. And accompanying that is what we really want to talk about, which is the executive order that was issued at the same time, Executive Order 13936, which is styled as the President's Executive Order on Hong Kong Normalization. And so this executive order does a couple of different things. And number one, I would say it sets out in some pretty broad strokes and gives direction to heads of agency about a number of different steps that need to be taken now to either suspend or eliminate different or preferential treatment for Hong Kong with respect to its treatment by the US vis-a-vis China. And that touches on a couple of different areas. It touches on immigration, it touches on export controls, it touches on customs and imports, it touches on CFIUS a little bit. And so the sort of early stages of the executive order set that out and sort of make it clear that the president is now directing heads of agency to take all necessary steps to start sort of rolling back, undoing, suspending, modifying, et cetera, all of those various different preferential treatments. And then the second piece is more in the way of what we would kind of traditionally talk about on this pod and what we see with respect to OFAC administered sanctions, which is the criteria for blocking sanctions to be imposed on various individuals who are acting with respect to Hong Kong. And I think there's a couple of interesting pieces there. And so we talked about the way the sanctions piece that exists in the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. We talked previously about the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act from late 2019, both of which contain some sanctions provisions in them. They also contain reporting requirements to Congress, which may sort of indicate why this has now been dealt with by executive order. But essentially the blocking sanctions that are identified and the persons who are now potentially going to be targeted for sanctions, it's notable because this is on the one hand, it's quite broad, and it doesn't track precisely any of the statutory authorizations. It's a bit broader than that. For example, any person that is determined to have been involved directly or indirectly in arresting, detaining, or imprisoning individuals relating to China's national security law, they can be targeted for sanctions. People who are responsible or complicit in actions or policies that undermine democratic processes or institutions in Hong Kong, threaten peace, security, stability, or autonomy of Hong Kong, engage in censorship or other activities with respect to Hong Kong, extrajudicial rendition, arbitrary detention or torture of any person in Hong Kong, or other gross violations of internationally recognized human rights, and then also to be involved or be the leader or official of any certain government entities that are involved in those acts. That's a very broad canvas with respect to sort of Hong Kong related sanctions that are now in play. One thing I will note that is not in here is anything related specifically and in any detail to foreign financial institutions, which was something we talked about in the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. That is not, there's nothing in here specifically calling out foreign financial institutions, although there are sort of many ways they could potentially be entangled by these sanctions. So let me stop there and let me throw it to you, Tim. So what do you, I guess on sort of both of those big, sort of the general criteria that's set out at the beginning of the executive order to get the apparatus of the U.S. government to sort of wipe out any special treatment for Hong Kong, and then on the sanctions front, what do you make of that? What are your sort of initial impressions?
So, I mean, my initial impression is that this was vast, relatively extensive. So all of the different directives that the president gave to the various agencies to kind of stop giving Hong Kong separate treatment as being a separate system, it's pretty extensive. I mean, it wasn't just exports. It was lots of different, it was immigration. It was other areas that kind of were quick and went beyond just kind of exports and imports, which was the headline. And then on the sanctions issue, I agree with you, Brian. I was surprised that they went broader in some ways than the statutory authorization. I mean, I don't think they went beyond it, but I do think that they certainly gave the Treasury Secretary lots of ways to impose sanctions against officials who had engaged in actions that limited the autonomy of Hong Kong. And as you said, there's not an express foreign financial institutions section, which did surprise me a little bit, although the material assistance, it does include financial support for anybody who is subject to sanctions, which is basically the same thing as the foreign financial institutions provision. So if they wanted to sanction foreign financial institutions, they could do it using some of these provisions. But I do think that having an express provision that targets foreign financial institutions like the statute did is a much bigger deterrent, in my view, than kind of having a provision buried in here that could be applied to financial institutions or lots of other institutions if you want to. So it was fast. It was pretty comprehensive. But we'll see if they start sanctioning people, because I think that's going to be the proof that's in the pudding.
Yeah, so I think that's a nice segue to sort of the next portion of this roundup, which is, so I would also note for those of you out there who haven't seen this, there is now officially on OFAC's website under the country and program page, there is now a Hong Kong related sanctions tab and link, which only just got put on there, in the last several days. And so that is, as we've remarked before, as a symbolic matter, that's kind of a big step when there's a new program created, essentially, and that's what we now have. But I do think that you raised the right question, which is, so the next piece of this that we're going to talk about are the sanctions against the 4 Chinese officials and the 1 Chinese government bureau in Xinjiang related to the detention and repression of the Uyghurs. And so we talked about this the last time with the supply chain alert. We talked about this when the Uyghur Act was passed by Congress recently. Interestingly, they took this step under the Global Magnitsky Act sanctions program, which is something, as we pointed out, they could have done all along without a new act of Congress, because that focuses on human rights abuses. And then in the same vein, China then took some steps to impose counter sanctions against U.S. government officials, including notably Senators Cruz and Rubio, who have been kind of at the forefront of leading the charge on some of these Uyghur-related sanctions actions by Congress, and also against Lockheed Martin in connection with an arms sale, a foreign military sale that was conducted with Taiwan. And so what I really want to pose is, I also add that just today, on Wednesday, the U.S. announced that they were closing the Chinese consulate in Houston. They're shuttering the Chinese consulate, which is something that we have seen from time to time. This is a step that is very, it's a real thumb in the eye to a foreign country for obvious reasons, but it tends to happen when there are sort of either espionage undertones or other kind of diplomatic fraying that's going on. You sort of eject everybody from the company, you PNG them, persona non grata them, and you sort of shut everything down. We saw a lot of this with Russia around the time of the election interference in late 2016, early 17. So that's kind of where we are now. So but this begs the question, in my view, whether all of this, including the new sanctions related to Hong Kong, is all kind of much ado about nothing, and is a lot of symbolic posturing, perhaps, and not a lot of weight to them. Because if we're talking about sanctioning Chinese officials, which is largely the target here of all of these things, those people are largely subject to travel bans. If not, there's some of the people who were just sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky sanctions, they had visa restrictions imposed by Secretary Pompeo some months ago. These are not people that are subject to criminal indictment. They're not people that are, this is clearly a complicating factor for them, but in the way that China has tried to erect sort of a separate system that is detached somewhat and disentangled from the US, I question how much real impact this is going to have on any of them, and how disruptive it is really going to be. And so I pose that question to you, sort of the Hong Kong sanctions and all these other measures that we're talking about, how much of this is just posturing and symbolic gestures, sort of shots across the bow going back and forth?
Well, I definitely think that a lot of this starts out as symbolic. So, I mean, I think you're exactly right to point out that even for a sanction that went against the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, where there was a statutory authority for imposing those sanctions as part of a separate program, the U.S. didn't utilize those authorities. They utilized an already existing authority under the GLOMAG to impose basically the same sanctions, which makes very little sense. But I do think that that OFAC is being appropriately cautious in using these new powers. Now, I will say that that's not a new story, but that these powers that Congress keeps providing the executive tend to take on a life of their own. So, for example, Venezuela started very small and is now a huge program. I think Russia was kind of the same way. I mean, I think Russia started a little bit bigger because it was multilateral and was in response to an invasion, but it started small and it has taken on somewhat of a life of its own. And CATSA is the same way. So CATSA, they still haven't used, and by they, I mean the administration, still really hasn't used the power to go after Nord Stream 2, for example, that it was given to them in CATSA, then given to them in PISA, and now they're talking about giving them more powers again. So it was passed as kind of a symbolic, we're sanctioning Nord Stream 2 without doing anything, but eventually the clamor becomes enough that these programs will take on a life of their own 2-3 years down the road, even if they start really small like this. I think you've got to be cautious because it's China. It's a gigantic economy. It's the second biggest economy in the world. And you get into a sanctions war with China, it's not like getting into a sanctions war with Venezuela or Cuba or Syria or a country that's economy is just not on the same scale as ours. So I think they should be very careful, and they appear to be very careful with this, but I worry that once you get this power, eventually you use it, and here it could have real unforeseen and unintended consequences.
Yeah, and I'll be interested to see when the first wave of sanctions comes under the new executive order here relating to Hong Kong. I wouldn't be surprised if it's by the time this is posted. I wouldn't be surprised if there already been a number of people that have been sanctioned under this. But I will say, related to that, just kind of to turn back to maybe the more practical considerations that we know our clients and many other companies are worried about right now. As we have said in the past, and I think as the executive order now makes plain, I don't know that there's unringing this bell with respect to Hong Kong is just not something that anybody should anticipate as happening. Period. Full stop. I think anytime. Now, maybe with the election in the fall and other events, perhaps over time in the next couple of years, things could maybe turn back around or sort of revert to where we were. But I don't think this is changing anytime soon. I think that's very clear here. And I think that has a lot of knock-on consequences in addition to just the worrying about, theoretical future sanctions risk and other complications relating to tougher export control treatment and other things for companies that are doing business there. And we've talked about this, and I've been fielding questions about this, about what do we do? Do we need to pick up stakes and leave Hong Kong? How difficult is this going to be for us to manage? How risky is it going to be? Cost of doing business there is almost certainly going to rise, and it was already, pretty expensive. So these are all the things that I think we're certainly monitoring very closely on behalf of a number of our clients, and I think are the questions that from the people who kind of live and breathe this, or who are actually working there, operating there, or have substantial ties there. These are the things that it's still a little early to know exactly how this is all going to play out, but I think the early signs are that this is going to be every bit as significant as it was sort of forecast to be, or it was projected to be from the early statements from the U.S. government. And I don't think that can be taken lightly. I think these are things that have to be accounted for and thought through from a sort of operational and compliance and just kind of business planning standpoint for many different companies around the world now who have some ties to Hong Kong.
Yeah, I definitely think and I can't see turning back. I mean, I think if this were going to turn back, it would have been behind the scenes at the time with the threat of pressure, and then diplomacy might have walked it back, but the Chinese could save face. They've been through it now. So they basically come in limited the autonomy of Hong Kong to a considerable extent, taken the international hit that they're going to take for it, had sanctions imposed against them. The idea that the Chinese would go back now after having taken the hit, I mean, I think it's, in some ways, I think this notion of treating Hong Kong like China, well, I guess China would prefer that Hong Kong have more favorable trade status while still being a part of China. In some ways, it plays right into their hand. I mean, we're treating China as Hong Kong, and China wants Hong Kong to be part of China. So it's really hard to see an exit strategy for this. I think Hong Kong is very different now than it was 6 months ago, and unlikely to ever be the same.
Right, agreed. And I think I'll just make sort of one final comment. We mentioned that the sort of sanctions related, the counter sanctions that were levied by China, and I would expect that. I've seen those sort of referred to as kind of appropriately tailored to kind of match what the U.S. did. It's would be termed to be sort of an appropriate reciprocal response. I think with the closing of the consulate in Houston, we're going to see something similar on the Chinese side that targets the U.S. interests in similar ways. I'm certain of that.
The word is Wuhan. The word is that
Yeah,
they're going to close the Wuhan consulate.
right. That makes perfect sense. And I think we're going to just continue to see this tit for tat over the course of the next, several months at least, if not beyond. And, given that the world and the global economy are still on very uneven and uncertain footing, trying to recover some places better than others from the COVID pandemic. The uncertainty that continues to reign here with U.S.-China relations, I think, just makes that even more challenging. So it'll be interesting to continue to track this and to see how this plays out going forward. But just I think more of the same as I don't want to call it a downward spiral necessarily, but feels a little bit like that in terms of the trajectory of how things are going between the U.S. and China now.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. It definitely seems to be an escalating series of moves and counter moves by both countries, which may end with the election. I actually think we'll end with the election either way it comes out, because I do think that what's going on right now, at least from the U.S. side, is in part election related. Although, what's happening in Hong Kong, I think any administration in the history of the U.S. would have responded basically the same way in terms of sanctions.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think that's right. So with that, let's for now at least put China to the side. I'm sure we will have much more China content coming for you
Absolutely.
in following episodes. But let's move on now and pivot to a couple of recent and interesting for different reasons enforcement actions from OFAC, and I'll kick it to Tim to start with Amazon.
Let's talk about Amazon, the company that has been helping all of us out while we've been in quarantine. So I'm sure that many listeners, probably all listeners, are very familiar with Amazon.com. On July 8th, Amazon entered into a settlement with OFAC as a result of a number of what appear to be screening failures. So Amazon was delivering products to persons in Crimea, Iran, and Syria, and that potentially had problems. Although the thing is that some of those sales likely were food and medicine, and so potentially could have been okay if done pursuant to general licenses. But I don't think those sales were even knowing, because I think they got through the screening. They were selling to individuals in foreign missions of countries like Iran, and they were also selling goods and services to SDNs. So basically, lots of different screening failures, which is not that unusual. Screening is kind of the dirty little secret of sanctions compliance, in the sense that it's actually really hard. You can't just buy a program and just kind of leave it to a program and get it done. But lots of screening failures. They were self-disclosed, and so that is one thing that I think jumps out at why this settlement is a little bit unusual. It was not huge in terms of OFAC settlements. It was $134,000 penalty, and so we've seen obviously much bigger penalties in the millions and billions. But for a voluntary self-disclosure, where you likely had commercial goods and services, all very small amounts at a time, relatively widespread screening failures, but those are almost always inadvertent. So it's a little bit unusual that you would have any penalty in a situation like this. But it seems to me that OFAC was trying to make a point that, where you have one of the biggest companies in the world with this sort of widespread number of screening failures, you really want to make an example to try and send a message to everyone else. Again, having worked with companies of this size in the past, this is a real challenge when you're trying to deliver goods quickly around the world. A huge volume, and getting the screening right is difficult. And so OFAC in the settlement talked about various things that Amazon did as part of the settlement to improve its screening function, devoted more resources to compliance, addressed some of the screening failures that they saw there, where there were essentially, they ran screening programs that wouldn't include common misspellings, didn't have address screening to try and kind of be a backup to where you had somebody who was sanctioned but making an order through a different name or through a different spelling of a name. And then again, improving the human function, because at the end of the day, figuring out how loose or how tight to set the screen, figuring out how to account for misspellings, how to account for address matches is really important. And then lifting the holds that a screening program might put on various persons is also really important, and requires people who are trained and understand what screening is about. And Amazon apparently committed and had done all of those things to improve its compliance program as part of this settlement. And so at this point, I think the big takeaway from the Amazon settlement, in my view, is that screening failures are of utmost importance, even in commercial businesses that do a high volume of business. You still got to spend some money and get your screening function right. And again, it's pretty hard. I mean, I know we both had a number of cases where that's been a potential issue, and both of us have kind of spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get that right. And it's much harder than people think. You just look at it and think, well, you just get some software, but it's a lot more than that.
Yeah, so I agree with all that. I think at the end of the day, this is mostly not exactly a cautionary tale, because this isn't, as Tim said, this is the penalty here, even though there was one, is pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. But reminding folks about the perils of screening and the need to sort of be vigilant about how you're screening, and making sure that the way you're screening is properly attuned to your business. I'll just mention two things quickly. So one is, in the OFAC notice, they noted as an aggravating factor, they noted Amazon provides consumer goods and services via its e-commerce websites and processes billions of global transactions annually as one of the largest and most commercially sophisticated companies in the world. Well, they've listed that as an aggravating factor, but quite frankly, billions of transactions. We're talking about a couple hundred here that are problematic. So that's not bad. So don't. I think anybody who's ever dealt with this knows that there are going to be some failures, whether it's your screening just misses something because of the tuning. There's a misspelling that you miss. There's, as Tim said, embassies in countries that would otherwise be fine to ship to are maybe not caught because you don't kind of have the right fields being searched, et cetera. Not to mention the fact that, as everybody knows, given the pace that Amazon sort of does business and their whole value proposition, this all has to be done incredibly fast. And we've talked to clients about this who are in the e-commerce and retail space, and figuring out how to inject that to your process, but not to completely debilitate and sidetrack your business, is not an easy thing to do. And so I do think it's a question that can be quite vexing, and I think does warrant further consideration from a compliance and sort of operational standpoint in a lot of different places. And with somebody like Amazon, who's this high visibility, that's being sort of flagged for something like this, I think that's going to naturally make others sit up and take notice. And I'm sure that was part of the intent here that OFAC had in mind by bringing this action. And then the other thing I would just mention, which is a much more minor point, is some of the violations that are cited in the notice are relating to a general license that was in effect with respect to Crimea, and in particular winding down certain transactions in business in Crimea back when those sanctions originally went into place back in 2014, 15. And basically they were faulted for not following up and adhering to the notice requirements, the reporting requirements that were attached to using those general licenses. And so OFAC said that your otherwise authorized activities there are sort of deemed to be nullified because you didn't report appropriately. And that's, I think, just a useful reminder as well that when, with respect to some general licenses and other obligations that companies have under the various regimes, that you need to be mindful of those types of requirements as well, because they're easy to forget or they're easy to sort of let slip by the wayside. And it looks like here they were not even forgotten. They were actually adhered to with respect to many other transactions, but there were a few that maybe slipped through the cracks or weren't timely reported. So in any event, just a couple of additional pieces there, but I do think at the end of the day, this is all about screening and all about thinking through how that may play into your own business as you read this. And so with that, let me pivot to the second of the two OFAC actions, our third and sort of final topic in the main portion of the pod today, which is a North Korea enforcement action focused on a company called Essentra FZE. And Essentra FZE is for those who didn't read anything on this, they were the violations here related to providing filters, cigarette filters, and other related products to North Korea through a variety of front companies in China and elsewhere. And Essentra is based in UAE, but in typical fashion, when we see these North Korea cases, what ended up happening was that because of the existence of front companies and because these were willful violations, they quote some of the email correspondence that's going on between the end customers and the personnel at Essentra about obscuring the fact that North Korea is the sort of ultimate beneficiary here. These were ultimately run through U.S. banks or foreign branches of U.S. banks that are subject to U.S. jurisdiction, and voila, you have prohibited services that are being rendered for the benefit of North Korea, and you have violations. And so the couple of interesting things I'll note here. So I think, as I said at the outset, this was a joint DOJ OFAC resolution. DOJ actually entered into a DPA, deferred prosecution agreement, with the company. They noted at the top of their press release that this is the first corporate enforcement action under criminal under the North Korea sanctions regulations. So that's interesting to note. This isn't a particularly large enforcement action. The penalty here was less than $1 million. It was 660,000 US essentially that was paid. But it is still noteworthy that is the case. There also was there's a 3-year period for the DPA, which is pretty typical. They have, not surprisingly, they've made a number of compliance commitments related to the DPA with DOJ, and also the settlement that they entered into with OFAC. There was no additional penalty paid to OFAC that was deemed covered by the penalty to DOJ. So, we do see these from time to time, these sort of joint actions. Obviously, again, I encourage people to maybe look at some of the excerpts from either the factual statement that accompanied the DPA, which is available on DOJ's website, or the OFAC notice, because they do have some juicy bits from some of the email exchanges, as I said, which talk about these are, back in my day as a prosecutor, if we were to get email evidence like this, you're sort of salivating because you just don't get it this clean this often. This is pretty clear, pretty brazen that they were trying to evade sanctions by not making it known that there was any North Korean benefit or involvement here. So that's always useful to see sort of another example of that, I think, playing out in a real fact pattern. And then, I think there's also, we talked a few episodes ago about some of the warnings relating to North Korea generally that have been put out by the alert that was put out. And even though that was more focused on cyber, I think the same threads that you saw there, the same threads that you saw in the UN report are true here, that the tactics to try to evade, to try to gain access to US financial institutions, to deal in US dollars, and to get access to potentially to goods that have that originate from the US or have ties to the US are continuing to persist, and there's going to continue to be a premium placed on having appropriate compliance measures in place to be able to suss those things out. And if not, then companies are going to be held to account. Again, here this was a pretty brazen sort of illustration of sanctions evasion. But I would, as a last thought before I throw it to Tim, there's clearly they make a big show, as is always the case in a DPA, that there's continued cooperation from the company into ongoing investigations of individuals and other entities. Given the number and extent of the number of entities and the extent of this, I wouldn't be surprised if we see additional enforcement actions coming kind of out of this cooperation, perhaps in the future, with respect to whether it's individuals or companies, especially if there's Chinese companies or other banks involved. The administration will certainly take every opportunity to take a swing at a Chinese bank or a Chinese entity who may have been involved in a scheme like this. So stay tuned there. But I do think that one big takeaway is that the lengths that companies will go to try to hide these ties are pretty extraordinary, and being able to weed that out in your due diligence and in your screening can be very difficult. And nevertheless, if you are sort of asleep at the wheel, or if you fail to catch one, then there could be some real consequences for you as well.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of quick takeaways from this. I mean, I noticed too that this was announced as the first corporate prosecution with respect to violation of the North Korea sanctions. I think what seemed to have gotten the company, the DPA, was that they did make a pretty thorough search of the emails and got emails that said things like, "Don't mention my country." That's what the North Korean purchaser was mentioning, and those are the types of emails that prosecutors salivate over. I think the second thing I would take away from this is that it is a much more traditional involvement of China in the U.S. sanction system. That is, as a diversion hub. I mean, that's been, when you talk sanctions in China, traditionally, it's diversion to North Korea or diversion to Iran has been really where China shows up in a lot of the sanctions actions until, recently. We've been talking a lot in the last few episodes about ways that China is being directly sanctioned, but this is a diversion case, and one that was relatively interesting. And don't forget that the UAE and Dubai shows up as the diversion hub here. So you've kind of got two big diversion hubs. You've got the use of Chinese front companies, and you've got some great emails that I think resulted from a relatively thorough internal investigation by the company that got them a relatively small penalty and a DPA on the criminal side in the face of some pretty bad conduct. And I won't be surprised if there is more to come in the aftermath of this.
Yeah, and just one final thought is that, and I mentioned this already, but I think it bears repeating. The only reason that we're even talking about this case is because there was involvement of U.S. banks and foreign branches of U.S. banks, yep. U.S. correspondent accounts. And when people scratch their heads and say, "I don't understand how the U.S. even has jurisdiction to go after something like this," this is it. This is the hook. And this is honestly, from a compliance standpoint, we are dealing now with a number of these on behalf of clients where, despite all good intentions and precautions and compliance measures, these types of connections were missed, and it's trying to sort those things out and understand how do you prevent against that, how do you screen for that, how do you train your people to recognize that, what can you automate, what do you have to rely on from manual human intervention to catch stuff like this. Despite what OFAC may think or anybody else may think, this is not easy stuff. It's tricky, it's hard to manage. And so for the people that may be both at the banks and otherwise who might be involved in something like this, catching this is very difficult, and I think continues to be one of the sort of big challenges that we see and that concern our clients certainly on kind of an ongoing basis. So with that, I think that basically brings us to the end of the main portion of the program for today, and we will pause for sound effects. And only 2 topics on the lightning round today, as I mentioned, and for the first one, I'll throw it to Tim for an introduction to a Nicaragua-related issue.
We don't talk much about Nicaragua, and for good reason. The Nicaragua sanctions program is relatively limited right now. It's entirely list-based. It's really targeting the government of President Ortega, and based on this notion that Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba are this troika of socialist leaders who are the designated enemies of the maximum pressure campaign by the United States. And so on July 17th, so just last Friday, we had another sanction, but again, this was imposed against President Ortega's inner circle. 2 people who were the target of these sanctions. One was Juan Ortega, President Ortega's son, who manages a communications company, public relations company, that also was the subject of sanctions. It does a lot of public relations work for the government of Venezuela, and in the view of OFAC, is involved in corruption and bribery, likely through this communications work. The other person who was sanctioned was a guy named Jorge Mojica. He's described by OFAC as one of the most trusted frontmen of the Ortega family, and acts as one of their personal representatives to create shell companies to hide their money and what OFAC designates as their illicit profits. And so, and another organization that Mojica controlled, it's a company called Mundo Digital. So basically, very targeted sanctions at the Ortega inner circle. The goal of these sanctions is to really put pressure on Ortega and limit his ability and the ability of his close associates to do business in the world economy. It doesn't seem to be having a huge effect on Nicaragua at this point, although it has put Nicaragua, I think, on the radar screens of many compliance programs around the world as a company that is, or as a country that is subject to U.S. sanctions, and so more risk than countries that are not subject to U.S. sanctions. But at least as of now, this program remains pretty focused and limited really on the Ortega inner circle and nobody else within Nicaragua.
Yeah, the only comment I would have really on this is, and this is something we've alluded to before, the approach on Nicaragua over time does tend to resemble more and more the approach on Venezuela, which is that go after the president's inner circle. Maduro and his family members in inner circle have been the frequent targets of OFAC designations. Same is now true of Ortega. Obviously, as Tim said, I think the reach and the scope and the impact of the Nicaragua program is more limited at this point, and that's to some degree the fact that Venezuela's oil industry is so massive and has had such a big, far-reaching kind of impact on other aspects of the global economy, and Nicaragua doesn't really have anything comparable to that. But I do think it's notable that the approaches, these approaches do seem to be really out of the same playbook, and I think we should expect more of the same. And if there are additional kind of aggravations, agitations, or provocative actions being taken by Ortega or any of his people, that we can expect more of the same going forward, and that anybody who's in Nicaragua or does business with entities in Nicaragua will need to sort of stay vigilant to make sure that they're not kind of tied up too closely in any of those, with any of those individuals or entities, or else, as OFAC is fond of saying, there's considerable sanctions risk that could go along with that. And so with that, I think we'll leave item number 1. And so item number 2, as I alluded to at the outset, is a little, it's a bit of we're diverging from the norm here a little bit to talk about something a little more personal. But what we're really talking about at the end of the day, for framing it within the context of our podcast, is human rights considerations as an underpinning for U.S. policy, and in particular U.S. sanctions policy. This is something that we do talk about a lot. We've already talked about today. We've talked about with respect to the actions the U.S. has taken with respect to the Uyghurs and the treatment of the Uyghurs by the Chinese government. It applies to Hong Kong. It applies to, as Tim alluded to, the global Magnitsky Act sanctions, which trace their roots all the way back to the mistreatment by the Russian government of a whistleblower and lawyer in Russia some number of years ago, and as he became a symbol for human rights considerations sort of around the globe. And it is a fact and reality that the U.S. does rely on that as a pretty significant underpinning for many of the actions that it chooses to take with respect to China and many other nations around the world that are deemed as either hard or soft adversaries, depending on sort of the day of the week or who you're asking within the U.S. government. That being said, as we have alluded to when we brought up a few episodes ago, the response here by the government to the widespread protests related to police brutality and George Floyd, and certainly in many other respects in the U.S. right now, the U.S. oftentimes, I believe, by China, certainly by many others, is being sort of called out for being hypocritical on many of these issues because it doesn't take any deep analysis of the news to understand that the U.S. is sort of struggling with many of these same issues and is perhaps taking on a do what we say, not what we do type of mode with respect to many of these items. So the area that we want to bring up is the death penalty, and in particular the fact that the U.S. certainly is not the only country in the world that still implements the death penalty in its criminal justice system, but I would venture to say that in what we would probably view as our own cohort of the sort of civilized world, if you will, the Western, more advanced economies, we are among the few that still does. I think, and so last week, to sort of tie this all up as to what prompted us to want to talk about this, Tim and I, we represented, unfortunately past tense, an individual, Wesley Ira Perkey, who was sentenced to death by lethal injection many years ago, sat on federal death row for many years, almost 2 decades. And we took up his cause and began representing him with some really, truly brave and heroic colleagues from the ACLU and federal public defenders offices in Indiana, Missouri. And we brought a claim in federal court in DC some months ago to establish that Mr. Perkey was mentally incompetent to be executed based on significant brain damage and other defects that he has suffered over time. And there's controlling Supreme Court precedent on this that says it's an Eighth Amendment. Essentially, it's unconstitutional to execute somebody who doesn't understand the reasons why they're being executed. And we had independent medical evidence of this fact, and we brought a claim. The district court in DC ruled in our favor on the day of his execution, the last Wednesday, July 15th. The DC Circuit, by a unanimous panel of Democratic and Republican appointees, also ruled in our favor, upholding the preliminary injunction. And then at 2:30 in the morning, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision with no opinion given, reversed. And there were a few other legal actions that were swirling around at the time, but those also were sort of undone ultimately by the Supreme Court and the majority of the Supreme Court. And the current senior leadership of the Justice Department was all too eager to move forward with the execution the day after his actual execution warrant had expired. And he was put to death at 8 a.m., approximately 8 a.m. last Wednesday, July 15th. And so I wanted to raise this and we wanted to raise this just to underscore the point that, the foundations of the U.S. actions on human rights bases, whether it's sanctions or otherwise, are fragile and are subject to attack. There is no question about that. And to anybody who doesn't believe that, I think you need to really take a hard look at sort of the facts on the ground, so to speak, and the reality of it. And not to, this is not necessarily from my perspective uh, trying to put the death penalty on trial here, but I think that as with free speech and free assembly and protest and some of these other things that are the underpinnings again of our actions, the actions of our government, I think it does bear scrutiny as to what the U.S. is doing on these fronts as well, and I think it does imperil to some degree the effectiveness and the authority that the U.S. has and would like to think that it has going forward as the branches grow ever sort of more far-reaching around the world with respect to China and otherwise. Where do we reach a breaking point? Because I think these are problems that are going to at some point catch up with us and people can pretend otherwise, but I think it's something perhaps a little less technical and antiseptic in the trade world to think about the next time you see something relating to a human rights basis for a sanctions program or a sanctions action being taken. Just think long and hard about what the reasons are for that, and perhaps what if China or anybody else had more of a hold on the global financial system, what they may be able to do to us if the shoe was on the other foot, perhaps.
Yeah, so the United States is a government that prides itself rightly on being founded on principles of human rights. I mean, it was founded using a document that stated that all men are created equal and laid out the human rights that were inalienable. Now, to be sure, our country has struggled to be true to what it said on paper, in the words of Dr. King. So it's not always been a straight line between the statement, all men are created equal, to a society where human rights of all are continuously honored. But until recently, not only in connection with the death penalty, but just generally, I think I was of the view that the U.S. still had a place and a role to play as a leader in human rights because it appeared to be trying to be true to what it said on paper. It appeared to be trying to go in the right direction, even with the death penalty, even though we're kind of an outlier among civilized countries. Even with the death penalty, the U.S. appeared to be moving towards being true to what was said on paper. The events of last week with Wes Berkey left me very discouraged on that score. The idea that our government would line up 3 people to be killed as what I view as a complete publicity stunt. Executions hadn't happened for 17 years, and this administration was hellbound to kill 3 people in order to end that, and then use that as an election year publicity stunt. It's just outrageous. It's the sort of thing that if it happened in China, in the Philippines, or if it happened anywhere else in the world, we would rightly be condemning them. The human rights bodies would rightly be condemning them. And then to see what we saw in the Perky litigation, and it happened with some of the others, was also just, in my view, an outrage. When 4 federal judges decide that there is a claim there, and 4 more on the Supreme Court decide the same thing, in a country of laws, the majority, if they had their 5 votes, if they were right, they should have said it. They should have explained it. I think you and I both, if they had written some sort of compelling or even made an attempt to show why it is that they were going to send this guy to his death in a few hours, and why, despite the fact that they were outnumbered 5-8, that was the right thing to do, I wouldn't agree with them, but I would respect that as some attempt to comply with human rights and the rule of law. But I will say that I'm very discouraged right now because the United States doesn't appear to be trying at this point. And when you're not trying, how can you stand as an example to countries like the individuals in Hong Kong, where we're trying to impose sanctions based on our view of human rights and view of the Chinese lack of respect for their human rights that's embodied in the national security law. So I will say from that last week left me both discouraged as an American, but also discouraged as someone who studies sanctions pretty closely, because a lot of sanctions policy, and you named all of the programs, Brian, so the global Magnitsky and the Hong Kong sanctions and sanctions with respect to Cuba. I mean, that's the justification for the Cuba sanctions, and it's justification for a number of the other sanctions, are built on this idea that the United States, it's important to foreign policy to be true to what we said on paper, and to really stand up for human rights, and to try and make sure, to the extent we can prevent human rights violations in other countries. But if we can't get our own house in order, I'm very concerned about our ability to do that around the world.
Yeah, well said. I don't think, unfortunately, I don't think we have any easy answers to any of this. I think we just felt compelled to share our experience and to flag this issue, because I do think it is one, as we've said, that people need to think about and understand how it does affect all of the issues that we do talk about on a regular basis, and whether or not there could be any consequences, down the road, perhaps, of from these inconsistencies and other tensions that we're identifying. So with that, I think we will conclude the lightning round. That was not the most lightning of second topics, but I think we're gonna give ourselves a pass on that one. It's been a long week. It's been a long week. But in any event, we will, that'll wrap us up for today. We will be back in a couple weeks. This will be posted hopefully the last week of July, and we'll be back in August for our next episode. So again, to everybody, thank you for tuning in. Again, please subscribe, give us a rating. Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, Overcast, YouTube, you name it. We appreciate the support. We appreciate all the nice comments that people give. Maybe someday Tim or I will get another haircut, but probably not anytime soon.
Not anytime soon.
Not anytime soon in the age of quarantine. But in any event, until the next time, please, everybody, stay well. Think on what we closed with today, and of course, please stay sanctions free.
Stay sanctions free, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.